Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass. And today, joining us for his American Compass podcast debut is our very own coalition director, Duncan Braid. Duncan is a veteran of the first Trump administration. He leads our membership group and works closely with our members, with our coalition partners on all our initiatives, and has over the last few months been focused on an especially important one that we call Back to Work, which is an outline for a comprehensive set of executive actions that a new Trump administration can and should take to carry forward a vision of conservative economics, fulfill campaign promises, and advance many of the priorities that American Compass has been focused on. And so in that respect, it's a great complement to the work we've done in the past, especially with our Rebuilding American Capitalism project. That's a much more comprehensive list of legislative priorities. So had a great time talking with him about that. Got into detail on lots of issues: immigration, trade, labor, family. You can guess the set of topics that American Compass podcast would cover. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about what else has been going on at American Compass this week. If you were not able to attend our knockdown, drag-out fight it's a debate, not a fight, between myself and AEI's Scott Winship as part of EPPC's Crossroads of Conservatism series. It was a great discussion about quality of life for American families. You can find that online at AEI. Certainly we'll be posting about it at American Compass as well. On the Commons, we have a ton of stuff. Henry Olsen on the New Republican, Drew Holden on Biden's economy, and other pieces as well. And then, of course, as usual, be sure to check out Understanding America, where we are always working to understand America. You can subscribe to that at understandingamerica.co. But without further ado, here is Duncan Braid. Duncan Braid, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Oren.
You are longtime listener, first-time guest, friend of the pod. What cliche should we use?
I think we just have to start this off with, can Drew put an air horn sound in here?
Drew? All right, yeah. we trust, otherwise we look very silly, but we trust that it's in.
Yeah.
Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. We are here today discussing a fine project you've been leading for us, Back to Work. Little known fact, also the title of an important Bill Clinton policy agenda in the 1990s, but in spirit, an apropos title for the return of a second Donald Trump administration and the sorts of work that can be done in the various agencies to implement the kind of agenda that American Compass and friends are most focused on.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this, how you went about it, and then we'll get into some of the details.
Yeah, sure. So I think kind of focusing in on what the new right can really bring to the new administration is something we've been thinking about for a long time. Obviously, I think the previous Trump administration did a number of great things, sort of shifting the conversation on the right from one of just like a pure market fundamentalist perspective to one of actually making a conservatism that is relevant to the average person. But then we had the brief Biden interlude where we sort of muddled through.
I think interregnum
is a good term. Where we sort of have this sort of muddled mishmash of progressive priorities, radical left priorities. But now that Trump has assembled this new coalition, sort of the genesis of this idea was that we would get serious policies that can sort of help make conservative politics relevant to those people and his voters.
Well, it's an interesting point that typically when we have a party switch in the administration, they just come in and just like do the reverse of the last one, right? Mm-hmm. There's literally a list of EOs that every Democratic president comes in and issues, and then the Republican president comes in and...
Well, I mean, to be clear, I think we should go in there and reverse all the EOs on immigration. I think that's kind of going to be the day one priority. So it's not necessarily entirely a bad...
No. But point being that it is in this instance more than that.
Yes.
That Trump is not simply trying to let's get back to everything George W. Bush was doing.
Precisely.
There's a whole new swath or tranche of topics where the direction that Trump administration, a more new right conservative administration would want to go, and that creates just a lot of interesting white space where people have not necessarily thought even, I've been very interested, which agencies do people care about, right? Like historically, Department of Commerce was like, what's the lowest possible tier? Now, all of a sudden, in the context of industrial policy, export controls, a lot of things that are happening at the Department of Commerce are sort of suddenly much higher on the list.
Right. And I think the agenda very much reflects that, sort of going into what we can actually sort of do day one to kind of speak to what President Trump campaigned on. You'll notice at the top of of course, you were part of the process of making this document, where we're sort of focusing on three broad themes of industry, trade, China, and then four broad themes, excuse me, and then family. And these are all things that the president has talked about consistently throughout his campaigns. I think, thinking back to 2016, we started off with very much a focus on immigration and rethinking our trade policy. And now here we are in 2024, ready to implement some of those things in a very serious way. And this agenda is primarily focused on executive action, things that the president, without any sort of new legislation, could do day one if he were so inclined. And they're very much not the kind of things that the previous Republicans would even consider.
Yeah, well, I should say it's a good point. In that respect, it's somewhat a ideal companion to rebuilding American capitalism, which is an entire list of agenda items, almost by definition, legislative actions. And so this is the executive complement in many ways. There are a lot of links between legislative things, executive things. Here, for the most part, it is things that could be done with law already on the books, though.
And obviously the ideal is that these things would work in tandem together. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that it seems like the Republican conference, both in the House and Senate now, are in a much better place, where before, in 2017, when Trump was first elected, you had this sort of asymmetry between the sort of more Republicans more invested in the sort of Paul Ryan agenda. But now that's entirely changed. I've been using the phrase "ready for prime time," and that's kind of the message here. Is that a lot of these ideas were sort of floating around in the ether in 2017, and now it's sort of we're ready to go now.
Yeah. So let's run through sort of greatest hits or most niche wonky thing you're excited about. Your choice. But I think those big buckets are probably a useful way to think about it, rather than just running through the endless list of agencies. So industry first, what are some of the key things that you see and have focused on that front?
Well, this is something both the president has talked about a lot and American Compass has talked about a lot. A lot of industrial policy is primarily a trade policy, and if you can get the trade policy right, you have fewer necessary interventions into the market. I think conservatives are naturally hesitant to use taxpayer dollars in this way, even if it is necessary and strategic to sort of revitalize American industry. But if you can get trade policy right, thinking about the issues like the 10% tariff that perhaps has to be pursued legislatively, but if President Trump comes in and mobilizes the entirety of the federal government to sort of get us to the right place on trade policy, that's sort of the number one cut there for getting us in a good place on industry.
Yeah, and so which agencies float to the top there? Because there is USTR, but they're mostly doing negotiations. So which agencies are you focused on for that kind of policy?
Well, so USTR you pointed out, but also Commerce, of course. Commerce does just about everything. Even NOAA is situated under Commerce, so they look at the weather, but they also look at the broader economy here. And so Commerce is going to be a huge part of that agenda, sort of focusing in on critical minerals, general export controls to China, sort of trying to encourage industries to transition away from dependence on those supply chains abroad. And then Treasury, obviously, that's sort of one of the main front line for the new tariff agenda, because they'll be implementing these exact things. And there's a number of things that Treasury can do right now to sort of get our trade policy back on track. Thinking about de minimis, Congress has been feverishly trying to address that all year, but there's authorities already on the books that the Treasury Department could just take the lead on day one.
Interesting. So, let's take de minimis as an example, because this has, in a sense, come out of nowhere. If you're like a real trade wonk, you've been doing de minimis for years. Last, I would say, really 12 months, in a sense, as Shein and Temu and so forth have become such large presence on the consumer side, I think it has kind of upped the salience of it. Basic premise of de minimis is we have this threshold under which you don't have to go through customs and potentially pay tariffs. Anyone who has flown internationally knows the part where you come back and you fill out the little form, and then you go through the nothing to declare line, even if you bought 3 souvenirs, because the 3 souvenirs are well under the, little did you know it was thanks to the de minimis threshold that doesn't matter. What's happened on one hand is the de minimis threshold has gotten pushed up so high, I think it's $800 now, that even very large imports, in a world where they can be shipped in individual packages, they don't have to be subject to tariffs. And conversely, whereas we never really cared about subjecting anything to tariffs anyway, now we actually are trying to tariff particularly goods from China. And so there's a ongoing fight in Congress. Do we lower that de minimis threshold way down? Do we have a different one for China, et cetera? What can be done while Congress futzes?
Well, I mean, Treasury has broad authority to kind of set the rules of the road on this policy, and currently it is set at $800. But there's a number of authorities that they could use to sort of address the sort of massive influx from countries of concern. I mean, that's more of a technical definition, but focusing in on more the massive amount of goods that are coming from the PRC on these issues, on this. I mean, you pointed to Shein and Temu, and I think that's the most visible element here. And these things are highly relevant to the average American consumer, right? The sort of influx of shoddy goods from China is something that impacts their daily lives. And I think even SNL has at this point gotten to the point where they've noticed that perhaps there's something clearly wrong and broken here, because we're not asking the fundamental question of why we can get shoes for $2. It seems like that is an issue that is just totally unexamined, right? And I think that a Trump administration is sort of interested in shifting production back to America, is going to ask these sort of tough questions of potential importers. I mean, the labor practices alone in China are abysmal. But then you sort of get onto should the average American have to compete against the sort of abysmal labor practices in China, and should firms be able to just ship goods to the United States without any sort of inspection, without any sort of duty taken? Once people make actual contact with this issue, is one where they recognize that it's an absurdity, and I think that's one of the things that certainly the Trump administration would be very interested in addressing.
Interesting. And so another issue that Congress has been futzing on for quite some time related to China and trade also is outbound investment. And there have been a number of legislative efforts to somehow try to start putting some obstacles in the way of just, whether it's private equity, venture capital, even just index funds, federal pension funds, everybody who's just sort of sending capital into China, taking stakes in Chinese companies, helping Chinese startups develop technology, even if by Chinese startup we mean Front for the People's Liberation Army. Yeah. Congress has not managed to actually do anything on this. Patrick McHenry, who was chair of the House Financial Services Committee, best known for making the argument that, in fact, investment in China is good because it allows American investors to really control China.
Yeah, eminently plausible.
Eminently plausible.
Sincere arguments.
A sincere and thoughtful argument. We will miss fine Representative McHenry. Regrettably, he has retired. That presumably opens up some space on the legislative side going to the new year. But this is another place where one need not necessarily wait on Congress.
Right, and the Biden administration has already acted in this direction, but these same authorities that they're using to take an inch on this issue, the Trump administration, if they were so inclined, could take a mile. I mean, here's where I do some pains to the wonders of a free market and a free society, is that they do tend to produce robust, legitimate capital markets. And why we are sort of allowing a totalitarian regime to have access to those capital markets is a bit of a mystery to me, particularly since one of the downsides, supposedly, of a totalitarian regime is that they don't have legitimate and robust capital markets. So the idea that we've just sort of let Wall Street fund the rise of China, our greatest adversary, is baffling to me, and I think it's baffling to a lot of people who are working in this space. And there's going to be a strong interest in sort of curtailing that. And naturally here we sort of, we've swung for the fences, prohibit all sorts of different kinds of outbound investment that go further than any sort of legislative vehicles. But that just comes back to the sort of core first principles point here, right? In that we shouldn't be abetting the rise of our greatest adversary. I mean, the greatest example would be when the thrift savings program was investing in PRC firms, and
that's literally federal employees.
Yeah, literally federal employees, and it's like including people who are serving in our armed forces. You're having their pension funds invest directly in firms building weapons that could potentially be used against them. It's entirely nonsensical, and it should just be. The president has broad authority to restrict that, and it's just something that just makes basic common sense.
Yeah, and to your point, Biden administration did use that authority. They just used it wussily. What would be the ad word form of wuss?
Cautiously would be the generous term.
That's very diplomatic.
Yeah.
Cautiously. No, but I mean, this was, I think, in my mind anyway, a real turning point in the Biden administration that initially had come out of the gate somewhat tough on some China stuff. They maintained the Trump tariffs. The initial round of export controls on chips were quite strong, and everyone held their breath for the big outbound investment executive order.
Mm. Well, I mean, they just fundamentally didn't have the clarity of vision. I mean, you hear nonsensical statements like big fence, or is it tall fence, small yard? It's like
small yard, high fence.
This is kind of the arguments of technocrats who want to nibble around the edges on these issues, and this is not the time to be nibbling around the edges on these issues. Now is the time to take actual serious action, and I think clearly the American people want serious action on this point. I think they communicated this relatively clearly here in 2024.
Yeah, and so I think you're right. Trying to remember what exactly they had like a press release and everything. It was like they used the term narrowly like 10 times in their press release to emphasize how narrow the restrictions were going to be. And it was essentially attempted to not actually limit any investment at all. And so those are all, I think, something that we'll see revisited. Wanted to switch gears a little bit, talk about the labor side of things for a minute, because this is an interesting area where, in terms of immigration, there's going to be a whole wave of immigration action on the enforcement side, where I think a lot of folks are in the Trump administration have obviously done a lot of leading thinking on that. There's also the labor market side, both on illegal immigration, but then also legal immigration, the wide range of visas and temporary programs and so forth. And that strikes me as an especially broad and attractive area for action that, again, a past Republican administration would not have considered, and a past Democratic administration would not have considered. What's the low-hanging fruit there?
Well, we've been talking about this, it seems like, for decades at this point. Mandatory E-Verify is so broadly popular with the American people. It is it's a 70-30 issue, and the thing that we can clearly do is sort of mandatory to administratively expand it to encompass federal contractors and people who are just receiving government funds. There's a huge amount of money that flows from the federal government to all types of firms across the economy, and that work should be done by people who are legal American citizens. It is already a rule, if you are serving in the federal government, you have to be an American citizen to do that, and so it seems like a no-brainer to just sort of expand that. It's what this all goes back to a lot of the writing on the Commons, where we've talked about sort of restoring the democratic sense to our immigration policy. This is just one of the key first steps that we can do on this front. Widely popular with pretty much all voters across all demographics, and it will just work. If we consider most people coming to this country illegally are primarily economic migrants, and that does seem to be the case, then sort of addressing the economic side of that thing is the clear first hurdle there. There's all sorts of additional things we can do on security. I think a wall would be extremely helpful to sort of limit the flow and help it make more administratable to enforce our immigration laws. But at a certain point, if you can just attack the very basic logic of coming to this country illegally in the first place, then you will have massively, and it struck a massive blow in addressing this problem.
Yeah, and then on the legal side, I think my favorite one is the H-1B mess.
Yeah.
So H-1Bs are the temporary visas. They're supposed to be for high-skilled workers. In theory, if you're an employer who wants to get an H-1B visa for somebody, you have to demonstrate that you tried to hire American workers, simply could not find someone, and therefore you need to be able to bring in a foreign worker to do that job. How would you assess the integrity with which this program operates today?
It seems like the key problem is what does the word high skilled mean? Obviously, firms would like to have that definition be as elastic as possible, so they can have as many H-1B visa workers as they possibly can. I don't think that system works for the average Americans. It seems like we end up with a bunch of folks who are competing against Americans trying to earn a decent living wage. And look, I think at the end of the Trump administration, there were a number of reforms proposed, and so it's sort of a matter of just sort of pushing that even a little bit further. Thinking about the lottery that is currently used to award H-1B visas, that doesn't exist anywhere in statute. That is a regulatory determination made to sort of try to address the sort of first come, first served basis that these things are supposed to be awarded under. So if that's not enshrined in statute, there's no reason why we couldn't try to shift it to a more points-based, sensible one, the kind of fix that we've all been talking about for decades and decades.
Yeah, the funny thing on both the E-Verify and the H-1B point is that these are examples where if you talk to someone, even someone quite knowledgeable in the area, they have no idea how absurdly broken the system is. I mean, one of my favorite things you talk to an immigration reporter doing a big story on immigration policy, and you say like, well, I think one thing we should probably do is make E-Verify mandatory. And they literally won't know that it's not mandatory. They would any reasonable person would assume we have an E-Verify system. Well, obviously people have to use it.
Right. The assumption that this has already happened is because it just makes so much sense, right? People are genuinely shocked that it's not actually like already law that you have to be an American citizen to work in the United States. I mean, this is why it continues to be such an overwhelmingly positive issue, and it just hangs out there in the ether for what seems to be no reason. It's just long-standing problems sort of bringing together a sensible center-right coalition to actually implement it.
Right. And then the same thing with the H-1B. You say, like, oh, well, we have these like very high-skilled workers. People like all these engineers, Nobel Prize-winning physicists, and so on and so forth. And people are like, oh, well, good, we should have some sort of visa for them. And then sort of like, well, how do we decide who gets it? And it's like, well, actually, employers lobby to qualify all positions for it, and then we choose randomly. And then people are like, wait, what? That's our program for high-skilled visas.
Yeah, and it's exactly what the American people don't want. And it's the problem emanating from every angle of the immigration issue is that it is just a carnival of illegitimate absurdities when it comes to, the asylum issue is almost beyond the point of this podcast here, but when you're thinking about that you can just walk across the border and claim that you have a credible fear and you're immediately entered into the country, it's just, the American people see these issues and are naturally concerned and upset, and it's one of the main issues that drove President Trump back to the White House.
All right, I want to talk data and metrics for a minute. And you can note that that's by far the most boring part, and you don't want to talk about it, and I will just ramble on about it for a while. Or you can humor me and be equally enthusiastic, because I think, to the point about like what is most squarely within the realm of executive action, and something that you generally, I think, see Democratic administrations do so well, and Republican administrations struggle to do at all, is realize that, literally what you choose to measure, what you choose to give attention to, ends up having incredible substantive effects for the way policy works. And so you end up with like the social cost of carbon, which we are going to assign an arbitrary number to, such that there are now $800 gazillion of benefits from whatever our regulation happens to be. You're just like, wow, like that was a really clever way to do that. What are some of the things that you would want to see a Trump administration doing on this front?
Well, I think looking at sort of new metrics is exactly what they need to be doing, because once you're able to enshrine these sort of new metrics into the rulemaking process, something people have to consider, then you start to actually get at the sort of thing that everyone complains about when they're talking about the deep state, right? Where the sort of like, okay, well, there's been an election clear based on a certain level of politics and that is totally misaligned with how the current bureaucracy works, but that's based on a sort of regulatory process that you have to actually be interested in impacting. And one of the key ways to do that is sort of the information that people are considering at jump. So if you want to really sort of derail a lot of the processes that I think people who are more populist and conservative are interested in, then you've got to be interested in the metrics and the data that people are considering. I think, and we talked about this in the agenda, right? I think Cost of Thriving Index is a great example of this, sort of looking at what it actually takes to live a middle-class life. And people theoretically are supposed to be concerned about this when it comes to families. But it seems like since the Reagan executive order back in the 80s, it's just totally gone away from that as something that they consider. Republicans could very much just sort of reinstitute that executive order, start encompassing new metrics into there, like GDP 2.0, and you would find that I think you would find that if you took these cost-benefit analyses that everyone does whenever they're promulgating rules, that you would find that those would be less favorable to the sort of the elite interests that people are often so frustrated with when it comes to these processes.
Yeah, one idea I really like is the broader Bureau of Family Statistics. If nothing else, forget about the well-being of the nation. Speaking as a think tank researcher, it is extremely frustrating that we have one class of data, GDP measures, unemployment measures, inflation measures. Every month, like clockwork, we release that data, within a month to the decimal point. You want to know like marriage rate or birth rate. These things come out, literally 18 months after the fact with virtually no attention given to them, very little ability to actually work with the data and look at it for different, subsegments of the population, very hard to compare back over time. And there's no reason for that. It seems to me fundamentally wrong, and your point that this now affects how policy gets done, what people talk about, why we are not reporting on the birth rate every month next to the unemployment rate. Like I'm not sure why one of those numbers is so much more important than the other one. You're like, oh, well, like the birth rate, how much is it really going to move? I mean, how much does the unemployment rate move? The unemployment rate has moved between 3.5 and 4.5% for years now. And we follow that tenth of a point every month, and yet you can have the bottom fall out of the fertility rate, and a few years later people say, maybe there's a trend there, but that's not really news.
Well, I mean, this is almost entirely a tangent, but
we welcome tangents.
Well, it interacts with the sort of left argument that why are people so upset? It seems like all the metrics that we're supposed to care about are good. It's like, so it distorts elite thinking to have these to have metrics be like very specific, very oriented to concerns that are not necessarily showing what the American people are actually concerned about. So if you're able to impact that, I think you just get a better class of policymaking and one more attuned to the actual people on the ground.
Yeah, I think I would very much enjoy that, if nothing else, for the charts we could make. So everyone can get excited for those. Yeah. What have we not hit? What is your favorite little idea out there that everybody needs to know about?
So, I mean, I'm very passionate about the immigration issue. I think we've covered that. So,
you would say that's it. We've covered it all perfectly.
I am really passionate about, and it's if we can actually give this sort of teeth, the sort of national family strategy at the EOP. I think the Republican Party has a new coalition of people that they need to have a clear idea of what how best to serve those people and serve the nation more broadly. And I think that goes back directly to the American family. It's the fundamental institution, and that needs to come from the top. So if we can actually have a sort of national strategy, one that actually has teeth, that coordinates across the entirety of the federal government, sort of hit things like cost of living, to sort of address child rearing and family formation and all these issues, I think we'll put that we could legitimately put America back on the right trajectory. I know there's all these metrics out there about how we're declining everywhere, and that's because everyone is doing the exact same policy on these issues across the Western world. That should have no bearing on what American policy is, and if we can change that at the very top of the government, then I think we'll get to a better place. I think there's so many things that we could do. There's so many things that haven't been tried at this point.
Yeah, and so going forward, we are mid-transition now. Cabinet is filling out. We will start to see the folks responsible for all these specific agencies and rulemaking start to fill in. We will hit the end of January. What are people on the outside supposed to be doing? Do you imagine this will immediately sink into a morass of years-long rulemaking, or do you see a place for a kind of day one agenda that some of this fits into?
Well, I mean, we talked about the day one agenda when it comes to immigration. There's all kinds of things you can do on day one, but the key is not focusing solely on what you can do on day one. It's getting started on day one with a clear process that is in accord with the federal rulemaking process. If you can start and you don't lose any time, then you'll see a lot of these things actually happen. So it's really just about getting the ball rolling and hitting the ground running. That is the key here. This is the whole reason for the document, right? Is that if you start implementing these ideas, start making the correct motions on the very first day of the administration, you will see a lot of this stuff get implemented, actually. No matter how much sand in the gears or resistance or lobbying that occurs in between, but once you get started, you're having the maximum amount of time to run these things down.
Yeah, well, it's a good point that all of these things go on these timelines with all of the process steps. Starting right away is therefore important. Putting the time in essentially to do it right is important, because the thing that gets done right sticks. Mm-hmm. The thing that has some T wasn't crossed somewhere along the way now gets the legal challenge that actually succeeds, and you're now midway through year 3 and just got remanded back to go rewrite your rule, and now you're not. Now you're nowhere. Yeah. And I think certainly we saw plenty of examples of that. You see it in any administration. Certainly was a challenge in the Trump administration first time around, and work like this, I think, is going to play a huge role in leading to more productive outcomes here. So, Duncan Braid, thank you very much for all of that and for joining us here.
Thanks for having me, Oren.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.